Hello everybody. There have been 3 cars to date to wear the DBS nameplate from Aston Martin. The first was actually something of an oddball. It really was a sneak preview of the then new V8, only without the V8 engine in it. It still had the straight 6 as seen in the old DB6. The current DBS, you could argue, is somewhat less spectacular. It may be one of the most powerful cars Aston Martin have ever produced, and it is, I think, the only real looker in the current lineup, but ultimately for me, it's a very flawed car. The interior simply doesn't feel that special, it's a little bit too firm, and it's also a hell of a lot of money. The DBS that I think everybody, with a few exceptions I'm sure, loves is this one, the sort of 2008 onwards car. Like most people, I always tend to think of these as more of a 2006 car, for one simple reason: its dramatic starring role in the James Bond film Casino Royale. That is one of the best Bond films of all time. In fact, it's perhaps second or third only really to GoldenEye. And this truly is an Aston Martin that very much fit in with the Bond character. To be fair to it, the formula that Aston Martin used to create this is somewhat similar to the one used for the current DBS. You take your regular car, in this case the DB9, you make it a little tauter, a little stiffer, a little lower, a little bit more powerful, bit sexier, chuck some carbon at it, and you're pretty much done. Now for the current car, it hasn't really worked many wonders, but with this, they created a legend. And in terms of outright sales, it actually wasn't massively successful. They sold less than 3,500 of them. The fact it was released almost perfectly in time with a global financial crisis certainly didn't help. And neither, I'm sure, did its list price. These should have been about £180,000. I ran a quick inflation calculator, and that's the equivalent today of about 240 grand. In other words, this costs more than the current DBS. The truth is that I think very few of these were actually sold for their list price. Apparently, most buyers actually also did not want the manual gearbox. They wanted the automatic that was only introduced a little bit into the car's life. That meant that Aston had probably already built quite a few of these, and they struggled to find homes for them. Now people talk like this is something of an undiscovered legend, a car that if you buy, you are certain to make money on. I personally don't believe that that's true at all. The DBS held its money for quite a while, then it dipped down, then it spiked back up with prices being very high a few years ago, and now it's settled a little bit. Influencing the marketplace, I think, has been the availability of the V12 Vantage and the Vantage S. Those are also a way of getting a nice big naturally aspirated manual V12 Aston, and for a lot of people they're probably the better car. I recently did a video where I talked about the Vanquish, the replacement for this car, and how it was all round the better car. And there are many things I said in that which, sitting here, I absolutely believe. The infotainment in here, I'm not even going to show you, because it's old and it's hideous. The interior, of course, is excellent, very familiar to anyone that ever bought or sat in a VH platform Aston Martin. You've got carbon fibre and leather everywhere with a little bit of contrast stitching, and it gives this a touch of life. The black on black scheme really isn't me, so I'm very thankful for the fact it has the contrast stitch and the silver wheels, because that livens it up just a little bit. The manual gearbox is not the easiest. Actually, that's not entirely true. The gearbox itself is not that bad. A 6-speed Graziano transaxle unit. That means it's sat at the rear. It's the clutch which really is a problem in this car. Aston say you should only expect it to last about 15,000 miles. In truth, that's not a particularly helpful number, because as with any wear and tear item, it depends largely on how and where you drive the car rather than the actual part itself. On the move, the DBS has a very different character to the later Vanquish. It's certainly a firmer, stiffer car. It actually has adaptive suspension as well. So you can choose between hard and really hard. That's going straight off. That familiar just shy of 6-litre engine produces here 510 horsepower, which was noted at the time for actually being less than what you got in the Vanquish S. That made, I think, about 520. Of course, this is quite a bit lighter than the old Vanquish, and indeed a very different car. Personally, I've never really loved the looks of the old Vanquish. I thought it dated pretty quickly, whereas the DBS I think is still something of a stunner. I would very much entertain an argument to say the later DB9s are actually a better looking car than the DBS. This is perhaps a little too muscular in some ways. Some of the extensions on the front, that bonnet bulge, look perhaps a touch vulgar for an Aston Martin. But this is no fugly princess. No, this is still an absolutely gorgeous car. There's also something you get with owning an Aston Martin that you get in very few other brands. There is a universal love for this car. The sort of love that I don't think you could expect to find if you turn up somewhere in a Lamborghini Huracan or a Ferrari 488. Maybe it's just a British thing, I don't know, but wherever I've gone, people really do love their Aston Martins. Steering is not too heavy, but got reasonable feel even at sensible speeds. The car's got pretty decent response all the way through the rev range, although it doesn't have the savagery of the power pack equipped V12 Vantage S that I drove last year. Yes, another start without stalling. Now, the owner tells me that it's not just me being a little bit useless with the clutch, he genuinely does have issues with it too. It's reversing uphill, which is the killer, and it's much the same in the V8 V12 Vantage. It's just far more difficult than it needs to be. But things like that are soon forgotten when you find yourself on an open stretch of road and you let this car breathe a little. Oh, she is skittish at the rear, I can tell you. Julian, this car's owner, did tell me that on a frosty morning, the back end you do have to keep an eye on. He wasn't joking. Now, it's not uncontrollable, nor should it take you really by surprise. It's just something you need to be aware of. Incidentally, I also wish to give a shout out to his son, Harry, who apparently has had a proper upbringing and is really big into his cars. So Harry, hello. If you want some career advice, don't become a YouTuber. Get a proper job that'll pay you loads and loads more money, then you can have even more cars. It is on a road like this where something like the Vanquish or indeed the V8 Vantage would really start to flow. The DBS, unfortunately, just always seems to want to fight it just a little bit too much. You can sense that if this was the firm mode for the suspension and there was a softer setting below it, it would work really well. But as it is, I think they went just a little bit too hardcore with this. The DB9 GT that I drove last year in comparison is actually, I think, a much better damped car for British roads. The trade-off for that slightly firmer suspension is a reasonable keenness to turn in. This is not a lightweight car, despite the extensive use of carbon fibre and aluminium in its construction. It weighs between about 17 and 1800 kilos. In fact, all VH platform Astons weigh roughly the same. It didn't seem to matter what they did with it. The later Vanquish, which is an all-carbon body, still pretty much the same. But it is spectacular, and there's one brilliant thing about this very particular car. It gets used, it gets driven, and it gets loved. That's exactly what these things are for. This gear lever proudly wears the patina of many, many miles, and I hope Julian never ever changes it, because it's such a thing to have in the centre of this cockpit. I've always been slightly bemused by it. It's a very odd shape and doesn't feel at all natural in the hand, but somehow I wouldn't have anything else. Now, this is one of the first Aston Martins, I believe, to have been fitted with carbon ceramic brakes as standard, and Aston Martin got them right pretty much first time out. These have excellent feel, you know what you're doing, they've certainly no issue bringing the car to a stop. In fact, today it's really traction with the tyres that's going to be more of an issue. And all round, actually, the whole car has been very reliable for Julian. For servicing, he's been using a company called HOLMESDALE, and he speaks very highly of them. Heel and toe is actually not that bad. Visibility is tricky, shall we say, because you can't really see much of that bonnet, although perhaps a little bit more than normal because of that power bulge. Rear visibility directly behind is excellent. Rear three quarters, not so much. Speaking of rear, storage space in this car is somewhat limited. This car has the 2+0 seating configuration, i.e. there's no seats in the back at all, but there's a sort of space where there would have been a seat. The fact is that even if you do get one of these with 2+2 seating, you can't really get anyone in there. I'd prefer this layout. It's actually a bit more useful. The boot is also far smaller than it should be for a big GT car. The fact is, the DBS is that kind of car where if it's little things that are going to bother you, you shouldn't buy it. This is about the big picture. This is a car which is Aston Martin really being the best I think that Aston Martin can. Flawed, for sure. It is too firm. I'd put different suspension on here straight away. But the engine, absolutely magnificent. No, not as fiery as it could be, but it's quick enough, certainly quick enough for the car as it's set up now. And it does just happen to be one of the sexiest cars to ever meet planet Earth. It's a stunner. It's not too noisy in here. It's all pretty standard, this car, so there's no silly exhaust or anything like that. And that's fine by me. Why would you want anything other than that? It's delightful. For some people, the fact that the later Vanquish is not available with a manual is enough for them to say it's the DBS that they have to have. And I totally understand that. The one car I still have yet to sample is the V12 Vantage S with the 7-speed dogleg manual box. Opinions vary quite wildly as to how good that box actually is. I simply cannot recommend the DBS as an investment car because I don't really think it's going to go up in value that significantly over the next few years. That being said, I don't think it's going to really lose much money either. The best thing to do is exactly what Julian has. Buy a car that really appeals and then just drive it. It had 24,000 miles on the clock when he got it a few years ago, and now it sits proudly at just over 62,000. I'm fairly confident this is probably one of the most used DBS out there. The Vanquish is a slightly softer, but only slightly, easier car to live with, a bit more rounded, I think almost as good looking, certainly punchier, and just a little bit more refined in all the areas that this car needed without really losing much of the character. But, and this is the nature of cars like this, the Vanquish simply isn't a legend, nor I think will it ever be. Certainly not the second Vanquish anyway. This though, absolutely is. What would you compare this car with? Very hard to say. A 997 Generation 911, and at this money you're in a sort of weird place between, say, a regular Carrera and a GT3, but the 997 is going to be a better driving machine, but that makes it sound like the Aston is somehow lacking, and truthfully it isn't. The steering is the area where the 911 is going to be a bit better, as would, say, a more modern Lotus Evora if you wanted to buy one of those. A Ferrari is going to have a bit more drama and theatre if you're going to compare it with, say, a 430. 430 also, of course, has a bit more pace than this, but it's a very different package. It has a completely different feel about it. It's a supercar. This is a GT. For me personally, in too many ways, this car is too similar to my own Ferrari 550, which means for the time being, there's no possibility of it making its way onto my drive. Ignoring entirely, of course, the fact that I don't have the 80 or 90 grand that it would require to get into this. In my current situation, it's actually something like the V8 Vantage, which would make a lot more sense. That is equally a spectacular car. And indeed, perhaps the best and worst thing about many Astons of this era is that they are all quite similar. And so if you really are dreaming of something like this, but you just don't have the funds to get you in there yet, do go buy yourself a V8 Vantage, because you're going to be getting a lot of the experience. The DBS will be waiting for you when you're ready, and when you are, I hope it won't disappoint you. It doesn't disappoint me at all. This is a very special car. I want to say a big thank you to Julian for bringing it out to me. Hello again to Harry. Please like, comment below, tell me which Aston, or perhaps which Bond car you choose to have on the driveway or in the garage if you could. And I shall see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.